tests made any difference. And our guest, Professor Stephen Cohen, is Professor Emeritus from the University of Illinois. He's currently a senior fellow of the Brookings Institution. While at Illinois, he founded the program there on disarmament, arms control, and security questions. During the time that he was in the academic world, he also served on the policy planning staff at State, specializing in South Asian affairs, security matters, and proliferation. He has founded a fascinating program, I think, for young scholars and strategists from South Asian countries and from China. And after leaving here tonight, he'll get some sleep, fly to China, where this group will be meeting over the next several days. They're young people between 25 and 35, and you can imagine the future leadership of those countries networking and making contacts now and in the future. He also has served on the Council on Foreign Relations South Asian Study in 1996. Professor Cohen is an undergraduate, MA from the University of Chicago, and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. He's the author of 8 books, author or co-author. He's written on the Pakistani military, on the Indian military, on questions of conflict resolution, the question of the future of Asia, and on the question of South Asia after the Cold War. Probably there are very few, if any, people in the United States who are as well equipped to deal with our topic this evening as Professor Cohen. It's my great pleasure to present to you Professor Stephen Philip Cohen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Byrne. I really appreciate the invitation to come back to Baltimore. I was last here 10 years ago, and it's changed substantially since then. Among other things, you've acquired a former Chicago Bear as a quarterback, and good luck. Baltimore is also famous because it had a long historic association with India, not only through the spice trade, which I guess the McCormick Building has been converted, but through missionaries and others. And I personally there's a family tie between myself, Baltimore, and India in the shape of the Calvert School. My children went to the Calvert School via mail twice, and I remember my daughter studying American history, I guess, or art history up in the Khyber Pass one night. And then down in Sri Lanka. It was marvelous because I could bring my children all the way through the region and carry Calvert with us. And so I've never been to the school, but I certainly would like to visit it. It is one of the institutions of higher education in Baltimore. Also, we're looking for bumper stickers from the Calvert School because 4 of my 6 children actually took courses from Calvert, so they do remember it with affection. I was the principal, my wife was the teacher. Yeah. I wish I was not here tonight in the sense that I wish that the Indians had not tested their nuclear weapon and I could be speaking to a much smaller group about other American interests in South Asia. And if there's a point I want to make tonight, begin with my conclusion, it is that the tests, while disturbing and unfortunate and in some ways unpleasant and dangerous, should not obscure our other interests in the region. Nuclear proliferation is a major American concern, major American interest in the area, but we also have other interests, and I'll come back and talk about those later. The tests, to begin with another concluding point, have attracted the attention of the U.S. government and the U.S. people, as well as others. So in that sense, some good may come out of this, but I wish it had happened in some other way. I'll first review the tests themselves, what happened, what we think happened, what they claim happened. Then I'll discuss briefly the reaction of the United States, China, and other states to the tests, and then turn to 3 questions. Why were the tests conducted and why were they conducted now? What are the implications of those nuclear tests for nuclear proliferation and the spread of weapons of mass destruction? And what are the implications for United States policy? Let me begin first with an overview of the Indian tests. And apparently there was a Baltimore Sun, Los Angeles Times report today which made the point that I've been speculating about and others have been speculating about for some time, that the initial reports of the test as produced by the Indian and Pakistani governments were not quite accurate. On May 11th, India apparently, that's in the written text and now it's apparently in quotes, exploded a fission or conventional atomic bomb yielding about 12 kilotons. That was their claim. And they also claimed to have exploded a thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb yielding 40 or 45 kilotons, and a low-yield device which had a claimed yield of 0.2 of a kiloton. An American friend, a friend of mine in the U.S. government, said that the Indian definition of kilotons may be different than our definition of kilotons. Our analysis, or the first analysis of the seismic data, has now just been produced by a professor at University of Arizona with a good reputation. He says that, in fact, there were not as many tests as the Indians claimed, or the Pakistanis, and they weren't as large as they were, and this leads to the speculation that there was not a hydrogen test, but we'll find out more about that later. 2 days later, on the 13th of May, two additional tests were conducted, or claimed to have been conducted, producing yields of 0.2 to 0.6 of a kiloton. All of this took place in the Rajasthan desert, not too far from the Pakistani border. In fact, the Pakistani seismic devices were one of those that first picked it up first. Only the first two devices were detected by outside sensors. It's possible that the Indian team attempted more tests, or that there were fizzles, or that the yields were unexpected, either too larger or smaller than they thought they would, than predicted. Because of the secrecy surrounding the test, we may never have an accurate account of these tests, especially since the Indians claimed to have tested several weapons simultaneously. For technical and for political reasons, they dug several shafts and lit these off simultaneously. As yet, there's no evidence of an escape of radioactive material from the test sites. Later that month, Pakistan carried out its own tests and claimed that it detonated 6 devices. And here's where credibility begins to be strained. If India had tested 6, then the Pakistanis would probably have claimed 7. You can be pretty sure of that. In fact, at the time, many of the newspapers, many of the politicians commented that this is cricket by other means, that the great rivalry between the two countries is in cricket, and this is another way of extending the cricket rivalry. There is seismic evidence of at least one Pakistani test, but no confirming evidence of yields, numbers, or types of weapons. The Pakistani tests are less interesting than the Indian tests. The world was aware of Pakistan's nuclear capability, largely through statements of American officials over the years. Pakistan was unlikely to have tested on its own. It was trying to reestablish relations with Washington after military and economic aid had been cut off in 1990 by the application of the Pressler Amendment. However, India had detonated one device earlier, 10 years earlier, in May 1974, more than 10 years. But it since then refrained from other tests, and all the experts, including myself, speculated that Delhi would move close to the edge, but would not move over it. I thought that India would declare itself to be a nuclear weapon state, but not test, or even have a test, but make no declaration regarding their nuclear weapon status. This would leave some ambiguity as to whether or not they were a nuclear power, and might have deflected American sanctions, which were required by law. But it turns out, as I found out after I left Delhi in March, I found this only after the tests, that 2 years beforehand, in 1996, an earlier BJP government had ordered a test, but the government failed before the test could be carried out. If this is true, then if there was an American intelligence failure, it was in not giving this earlier BJP attempt adequate weight. The BJP is characterized as a right-wing Hindu fundamentalist party. I don't agree with the characterization, but it'll have to do for the moment. We may want to discuss that in questions and answers. Now, what were the responses to the tests? The regional and global responses have a Rashomon-like quality. Any of you have seen the Akira Kurosawa film, the same event is seen in very different ways by different parties. Many Indians saw the test as an assertion of Indian greatness and now expect the West, especially the United States, to admit India to the nuclear club and the Security Council of the United Nations, and apologize for our past restrictive policy on technology transfer. Only a few voices in India, which have since grown in number, pointed out in May and June that the test did not enhance Indian security, but may have hurt it. There's now a major debate underway in New Delhi and other major Indian cities as to the next step to take. The Pakistanis were taken by surprise. Indeed, Pakistan had been exultant over its own nuclear achievements, and it had begun to taunt the Indians with a series of provocative missile flights, one of which, the Gauri, was allegedly capable of reaching Indian bases deep in the south. Pakistanis had routinely cried wolf about the Indian nuclear program, but were taken aback by the tests and forced to conduct a series of their own. Indeed, it could be speculated that one of the reasons behind the Indian tests was to force the Pakistanis to test, because the Indians knew that Glenn sanctions would come down on both countries, and that Pakistan was more vulnerable than India, and that the Indians would survive the sanctions, the Pakistanis might not. It reminds me of the potlatch ceremony in the Pacific Northwest, where tribes try to compete with each other by destroying their own property. There's some analogy in there. China reacted with deep anger for two reasons. First, the Chinese have had the test raised strategic concerns for China. China was convinced that its position on the border dispute with India was correct, that India remained provocative in Tibet and along their contested frontier. The India-China border conflict is the world's largest territorial dispute in existence today, and it's amazing that less attention has been devoted to it than has been. In fact, one of the things the U.S. government is somewhat unaware of is that the American position on that border dispute is the Indian position. We support India on their dispute with China. We've never formally renounced our support for the Indian claims on the territory. In 1987, there was a border skirmish that led to a series of India-China talks which have frozen but not settled the dispute. Some Chinese believe that the Indians might still be acting as agents of either the Russians or the Americans or both in an attempt to encircle and weaken China. Even then, the Chinese had moved closer towards India on their position on Kashmir, the disputed territory between India and Pakistan. Thus, the Chinese were especially irritated to hear from New Delhi over and over again after the tests were conducted that the real enemy of India was China. The Indian tests were seen as a revival of a new front to the southwest of China. It will be interesting to see whether the Chinese do anything on the ground to balance the Indian test. There are a lot of things that the Chinese could do to put pressure on the Indians. Second, there's a cultural undercurrent to Beijing's response. Chinese officials have a generally low opinion of India and resent Indian claims of civilizational greatness. To Beijing, then, the Indian test and the claim that they were carried out in order to make India the strategic equal of China was seen as both threatening and insolent. Washington was caught by surprise. For those Americans who had suspected India's commitment to arms control, this was proof that the New Delhi had, in the words of a Washington Post editorial a few days ago, always wanted a nuclear bomb for strategic and nationalistic considerations. I think that's absolutely untrue. The Post went so far as to portray Pakistan as the unwitting victim of India's gallop down the nuclear road. This is, in my judgment, a wrong assessment. For the American proliferation hardliners, the solution was to impose sanctions immediately on New Delhi after the test and even increase the punishment to serve as a lesson to other countries. Those who supported the move to establish better relations with New Delhi in the past year and a half, 2 years, were what I call Pearl Harborized. They were stunned by the event, especially since they had been either lied to or the subject of disinformation by the Indian government as to the BJP's real goals and the intention of the BJP government to carry out a test. It turns out that the most senior Indian foreign ministry official, the foreign secretary, was in Washington just a few days before the test and pledged to the U.S. government that no tests were forthcoming. He did not know, apparently, that there were going to be tests. The tests were carried out on the orders of a very small group of BJP politicians and done by a very small group of Indian scientists. So the disinformation or misinformation program succeeded, but I think has angered a lot of people who are otherwise inclined to give India the benefit of the doubt. American conservatives generally said, "I told you so," and gave the Indians credit for awakening the Clinton administration from its intoxication of treaties with security. Some argued that the test represented a turning point in the post-Cold War period. Other conservatives saw this as a good reason to build an ABM system for the United States. Was there an intelligence failure in Washington? Yes, technically there was, but you have to factor in the considerable attention that the Indians gave to secrecy and deceiving outsiders from their true purposes. There's a joke in Delhi that I've heard for many years. An Indian can keep a secret by only telling one person at a time. This time, they kept the secret. They even went so far to fly in the Indian scientific team to the test site wearing Indian Army uniforms so they couldn't be detected by satellite or by ground observers as civilians as opposed to military personnel. It was a very successful disinformation program, but it raises questions in my mind as to the degree to which we can trust the Indians in the future when they tell us something. On the other hand, if there are any Indians in the audience who are familiar with the region, Indians will point out, and I think they're perfectly justified in doing this, that on many occasions the United States, American officials would go to New Delhi and have their conversations and dialogue with the Indian counterparts, and then go off to Islamabad or go off to Beijing and do something which directly affected Indian security without having told the Indians. So what the Indians did was, in effect, give us back some of our own medicine. And if we want to have a long-term relationship with India, or with any country for that matter, this kind of deception between would-be friends cannot go on. After the test, there's been considerable diplomatic activity, and undoubtedly Strobe Talbot, the Deputy Secretary of State, is flying in the air somewheres to meet with his Indian counterpart. The tests were followed immediately by a period of inept Indian diplomacy by the BJP-dominated government. Besides angering the United States and China, there was considerable shock in the arms control community, which had always regarded India as a friend to global arms control initiatives. Even the non-aligned states have responded critically, and some, such as Nelson Mandela, have criticized the test publicly and then called for a new approach to resolving the Kashmir problem. This ineptness is not surprising. While the BJP was the most hawkish political party in India, it is riven by the same factionalism as the others. While some elements of the party were making plans to bring radioactive sands from the test site to all parts of India to put in temples, or to build a temple on the site of the test blast, others, such as Jaswant Singh, very respected senior party official, were engaged in a damage control operation, flying from country to country to explain the Indian action. The Indian government must now devise a policy to justify the deed that they carried out. This will not be easy because there are real questions as to what it means to be a nuclear weapon state in our era. This overview raises three broad questions in my mind. First, why did the Indians conduct the tests? Second, what impact will they have on the larger proliferation problem? And third, what options does the United States have in the region? Why the tests? There have been many suggestions or theories put forward as to why the Indians conducted these tests at this time. The Post, for example, as I've said, thought that India had an unstoppable urge to conduct nuclear tests and to be a nuclear weapon power. If that's the case, then why did not India test more nuclear weapons after 1974 and become a nuclear weapon state right at that time? I've talked to a former Indian prime minister who said, maybe we should have done it, but we didn't do it then, now we shouldn't do it at all. And this was previous prime minister to the present government. So there were strong reasons why the Indians didn't move ahead to a nuclear weapons program 25 years ago. Indians themselves have argued that India was forced into testing and weaponization by the strategic coalition of China, the United States, and Islamabad. That strategic compulsions forced the Indians to test and to become a nuclear weapon state. Others have claimed that the test came about because of domestic politics, the peculiar politics within the BJP, and the fact that the BJP had a large election platform and really couldn't carry out any of it because it was in a coalition with, I think, 12 other political parties. And the arrangement of the coalition was that the BJP would not press the issues that were closest and dearest to it, which included doing something about Kashmir, maybe bringing Kashmir fully into the Indian Union, rebuilding a temple at Ayodhya, which the BJP supporters had torn down in 1993, and also pursuing a policy of Swadeshi economics, that is, native economics. The BJP couldn't pursue these strategies, they probably didn't want to in many cases. But what they could do, and what they could do secretly, and what they did do, was to test a nuclear weapon, which was the fourth item in their election platform, election plank that they said they would carry out. There may be some truth in all of these explanations: international politics, domestic politics, security problems, and so forth. In my view, no single factor explains the tests. My preliminary approach has been to aggregate these explanations into categories of long-term, medium-term, and short-term. And in the aggregate, these made it possible for 3 or 4 men only, maybe 4 or 5, to step across the nuclear threshold, making the final decision to test only days before the tests were actually conducted, as far as we know now. Let me discuss some of these factors. One relevant long-term factor, which is not fully appreciated in the United States, is India's sense that it is one of the world's great civilization powers. This view was developed during the nationalist movement and has supported across the entire political spectrum of India. Whether you're a Nehruvian or a Gandhian or a very conservative Hindu extremist, there's a shared belief that India is one of the great world civilizations and is not getting the kind of respect and attention that a world civilization deserves. When Sam Huntington wrote his book, Clash of Civilizations, the Indians got it and said, we've been saying this for 200 years. This is nothing new to us. We are one of the great civilizations. And Huntington does put India into that category. The fact that each of these so-called civilizations, the Chinese civilization, the European civilizations, and so forth, not the Islamic civilization, quote unquote, and I'm using these terms with quotes around them, were mostly represented in the Security Council, and the Security Council members had nuclear weapons gave rise to a bizarre logic in India. Going nuclear makes one a great state, and this will lead to an invitation to take a seat at the center of global power. In other words, you can short-circuit the long, difficult task of becoming a great power by lighting off a few nuclear weapons. And many Indians, not all, but many of them sort of expected the United States to come rushing to New Delhi, American officials to come rushing to New Delhi and say, you're now a great power, we'll let you into the UN Security Council with a veto, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, it had the exact opposite effect on Americans and others. The medium-term factors, I think, were more critical because they were more fluid. If you look at economics, domestic politics, and security issues. From 1990, India's objective security situation did deteriorate. The Indians are correct in saying that the threats to their country probably did increase, although threat perception is always a subjective matter, not necessarily objective. Primarily, the Indians lost their chief strategic superpower patron, the Soviet Union. Soviet Union disappeared, and what was left of the Soviet Union, Russia, normalized its relationship with China. The Pakistanis in 1990 were determined to have nuclear weapons by the United States government. They probably had them earlier. And the Indian internal security situation turned very, very bad in 1990 with an uprising in Kashmir. So these three things happened almost the same year, one after another. End of the Cold War, the emergence of Pakistan as a nuclear power, and severe internal security problems. Together, this made Indians far more nervous about their security situation than they had been for many years. The conflict with China had been papered over but was still unresolved. Second, India's domestic political order began to unravel around 1990, 1991. India, at that point, entered into a series of coalition governments. That is, no political party could form a government on its own. Each had to turn to coalition partners to form this government. The coalition partners were often small or fragile parties themselves, and they would come and go depending on what was offered to them by other parties. So it was very much like a juggling act where you have to keep a bunch of balls up in the air. Every once in a while somebody steals one of the balls. You have to produce another one out of your pocket, throw that up to take its place. And 3 or 4 Indian governments fell in succession during this period. And the BJP government, when it assumed power in 1996, first of all, was very concerned about its survival, above all. And those of you know politicians, there's one thing a politician is concerned about in a democratic state, and that is the next election. And I think, from my own understanding of the situation, the BJP leadership was very much concerned about getting reelected, and they wanted to go back to the polls, back to the electorate with a major accomplishment. And that's probably why in 1996 they ordered tests. They couldn't be carried out, and that's probably also one reason why they ordered tests in 1998. They could be carried out at that point, and they could claim that they've done something which would move India, which all Indians could be proud of, and so forth. So I think the domestic political situation did play a role. Only India's slightly worsening economic situation argued against testing. The Indian economy began to open up in 1991, and liberalization began to take place, and things looked very good for about 3 or 4 years, 5 years. Then in the past 2 years, they've begun to slow down again. I gather there's sort of an upturn once more. At the time, this was in May, this was thought to be a factor arguing against testing. But I think the BJP leadership must have calculated the tests were so important that they could be conducted at a period of economic downturn. But India wasn't undergoing a depression. This is part of the larger Asian economic disorder. Economic constraints will be important in the future, though, because to build a full-fledged nuclear weapon system, even a modest one of 100 and 125 weapons with missiles and perhaps submarines and other capabilities, will require a lot of money. And unless India grows fairly rapidly, and unless the government is able to divert some of that new income to building nuclear weapons, India is going to have a very small, modest nuclear capability for years to come. In other words, it's going to have a nuclear capability which will not be able to do much damage against China. And since China was the real claimed reason why India went nuclear, there's a contradiction between India's declared objectives and, I think, the capabilities over the next few years. we'll find out more about that. I'll find out more about that in Delhi when I arrive October 1st. Well, finally, there are several short-term factors. One I've just discussed, picked up in passing, that the BJP was worried about its electoral chances right now, should there be a new election. Let me parenthetically, Jaswant Singh, who's negotiating with Strobe Talbot, has spent much of his time traveling not between New Delhi and Washington, or New Delhi and Britain, where they've met, but between New Delhi and the state of Tamil Nadu, the city of Chennai, former Madras. One of the BJP's coalition partners, a former film star, is threatening on a daily, if not hourly basis, to pull out of the coalition. So poor Jaswant, who's a distinguished, very interesting man, has been commuting back and forth from Delhi to Chennai, to Delhi to New York, negotiating both with the United States on one hand to get the sanctions lifted, but also with Indian political leader, on the other hand, to keep the government in power. And also there's negotiations with other parties. So it's still a very fluid, fragile coalition. And you could expect that if things don't go well in the negotiations with the United States, that the BJP government might well take more steps along these lines for domestic political reasons, although that's not the only factor involved. Second, I think that international treaty diplomacy was a major factor in the timing of the tests. The way in which the Indians lost their attempt to stall or delay the permanent extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty 2-3 years ago, the way in which the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT, was really rushed through without taking into account Indian strategic concerns. This gave the Indian hawks the ammunition that they needed. They could and did argue that the rest of the world was out to disarm India by forcing it to sign the CTBT. And the testing had to occur sooner rather than later before the option to build a nuclear weapon was foreclosed by the CTBT. So American diplomacy, I think, contributed to some degree, the diplomacy of the past 6 months, to forcing the Indian hand on the tests. It certainly strengthened the Indian hawks who wanted to test. Finally, the Pakistanis obliged the Indian hawks, and this may have had some marginal influence on the decision, by launching a very provocative missile test in early May, just before the Indians tested. This certainly did not make a difference in the Indian inclination to test, but it may have removed all doubts in New Delhi and demonstrated to New Delhi that neither China nor the United States were going to restrain Pakistan. And the Indians were especially irritated when the Pakistanis began to gloat and boast about, their wonderful technological accomplishments, when everybody knew that the missile was probably a North Korean missile that painted with Pakistani colors on it. It really was not indigenous to Pakistan at all. Okay, let me speak briefly about the test and proliferation, because my views are short but unpopular, and then talk about the test in American policy. Besides adding 2 new nuclear states to the list of nuclear weapons powers, I do not see these tests as changing in any fundamental way the world's movement away from reliance upon weapons of mass destruction. There is no proliferation crisis. We know which states want to acquire nuclear weapons. Most already want biological weapons as well. They don't need the example of India or Pakistan to stimulate their interest. I mean, what the Indians did is not going to change the mind of the North Koreans or the Iraqis one way or the other. We have also have reasonably effective negotiations underway to reduce or contain the spread of weapons of mass destruction, and in the last resort, or perhaps sometimes earlier than that, the military capability to ensure that rogue states do not acquire nuclear weapons. The Indian and Pakistani tests do raise 2 critical proliferation problems. First, that India and Pakistan not assist others in acquiring nuclear weapons or nuclear technology, or even missiles for that matter. The history of the spread of nuclear weapons is not encouraging. Almost every nuclear weapon state has assisted others and then later regretted it. Indirectly, the U.S. helped the British, and the French helped the Israelis, the Russians helped the Chinese, and the Chinese helped the Pakistanis. Only the British themselves seem to have been left out of this game. So there's a concern, I think, a well-founded concern, that India and Pakistan, and Indian and Pakistani scientists not begin to share their technology with others. They both said publicly that they would not do this, but I think we should be able to get a more formal commitment from them not to share these technologies with other states. Second, we should be concerned that they use extreme caution in building and deploying their own weapons, Both India and Pakistan have made public declarations as to their responsibility as nuclear weapon states. But we need to reduce the temptation to make a profit, both geopolitical and financial, from their investments, and we need to reduce the new risk of accidental nuclear war. I've just come from far-off distant Washington, D.C., and this morning Richard Haas and Mort Halpern held a press conference and released the report of a task force, a study group, independent study group, that the Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings, co-sponsored. And a number of our recommendations in that do deal with the issue of nuclear safety. And some people in that task force were debating and discussing the question of actually assisting the Indians and Pakistanis with nuclear technology which would make their weapons more secure. I don't think the United States should do this. I know that there's strong resistance in our nuclear weapons program to sharing this with other countries, but it's conceivable that the Russians might help the Indians and the Chinese might help the Pakistanis. Ensure that their command and control systems are fairly secure, because I do have some concerns about this, especially in the case of Pakistan, which is a country in great trouble right now. Now, what about American policy? The Indian tests arrived at a moment when American policy was changing direction. Had this change taken place earlier, a few years earlier, it is doubtful that the Indians would have tested. I think the U.S. pursued a very tough and unproductive policy towards both countries, trying to get them to sign treaties that they had no interest in signing, and as a result strengthened the position of the hawks in both countries, but especially India. We began to moderate that policy 2 years ago, about the time of an earlier Council on Foreign Relations report, but that change came too little and too late. The U.S. government moved slowly at best and was unable to reach a consensus on the best strategy to deal with the Indian and Pakistani programs. Within the government, there were those on the one hand who wanted to and still want to continue the policy of sanctions and punishment for the covert or non-weaponized programs that had been created by 1990. On the other hand, there are those who wanted to take a comprehensive approach to the underlying cause of India's and Pakistan's motives for acquiring nuclear weapons, especially the Kashmir problem. I would tend to fall into that school. The diplomacy surrounding the extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the new Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty intersected with this debate and made things worse. Officials in the first Clinton administration thought a mixture of inducement and sanction could get the Indians to sign the CTBT and even the NPT. This would have, in Indian eyes, put an end to their calculated policy of nuclear ambivalence, or maintaining the nuclear option. What we offered was too little and too late and ineptly handled. Even earlier this year, American officials were talking about capping, rolling back, and eliminating the Indian and Pakistani nuclear weapons programs. For two states that felt that their vital security interests depended on maintaining at least the option, this provided no room for negotiation between us and them. I noticed that no American officials talked about capping, rolling back, and eliminating the Israeli nuclear program, which would have been politically impossible in this country. But India and Pakistan were seen as soft political targets for American diplomats, and they attempted to pressure the Indians in both countries, I think foolishly. At the moment, the Indians do have our attention. Deputy Secretary Talbot has had 5 rounds of talks with one of the most senior and respected BJP officials, but I'm certain that no agreement will be reached soon, which means that sanctions that were imposed under the Glenn Amendment will continue indefinitely. These have had some impact on India, even more on Pakistan. They've also had a deeper negative impact on informed opinion in both countries. In this sense, I think we're losing India and Pakistan, and the sanctions have given new credibility to anti-American groups in both countries. Increasingly, this includes the Indian scientific community. Pakistan's drift is just as serious, given the upsurge of Islamic sentiment in that country, the weakness of the government, and its very serious security problem due to its overextension in Afghanistan. The U.S. should now move as quickly as possible to lift these sanctions, assuming that India and Pakistan provide assurances about several key aspects of their nuclear programs. First, we need real guarantees that they will not share nuclear technology. Second, some progress has to be evident in their long drawn-out negotiations on various confidence-building measures, including serious talks on Kashmir. And third, there's a legitimate American and global interest in their demonstrating that their command and control system arrangements are reliable and secure. I think it's premature for us to demand from either country a full-blown statement of their nuclear doctrines. Both, especially India, are groping towards the questions, and they don't really have the answers. We should try to influence the debate that's underway in both countries, especially through track 2 and private efforts. As nuclear weapon states, India and Pakistan will enter the club at a very modest level and will remain there because of financial and technical constraints. We have no interest in helping them develop nuclear systems, but we must remain concerned that the systems they do develop are reliable and secure. Let me conclude now, so we can have time for questions. Am I okay for time? Okay. I think beyond the proliferation problem, we must remember that the region is important to the United States for many more reasons. The Indian tests were in large part a demand for attention, not just a response to a deteriorating security situation. India is not just the un-China. India contains a fifth of the world. India and its neighbors already surpass China in population, and India alone will surpass China in 20 years or so, a figure which upsets the Chinese, because for many years they've been able to say, well, you must treat us seriously, we're the world's largest country. The Indians are just waiting to be the world's largest country. Being number 2 in that league doesn't carry much weight, apparently. India should be seen strategically not as an alternative to China, but as a form of strategic reinsurance for the United States, should we be faced with an aggressive China in the future. We would want India on our side. On the other hand, the Indians don't want to fight our wars for us, and we shouldn't view India as a way of fighting the Chinese to the last Indian. As for our economic relationship, India has a very large pool of scientific and technical manpower, probably the world's 4th or 5th largest number of scientific personnel. They claim 3, but that figure is certainly wrong. The large Indian middle class could be a market for American products, but more likely in cooperation with Indian corporations. And certainly India needs energy, and several American corporations are eager to provide it. More important than all of this, I believe, is the fact that the largest collection of people living under democratic rule are to be found in South Asia. I think it's an important American national interest that the region remain democratic and not slip into either some form of totalitarianism or spin apart like a giant and nuclearized Somalia or Bosnia. 6 months ago, when Ambassador Naresh Chandra was visiting Illinois, my previous incarnation as a professor, he gave a talk in Peoria. I'm sure all of you know about Peoria. Richard Nixon made Peoria very famous. So I explained Peoria's interesting history to Ambassador Chandra, and I said it was the heartland of flyover country. And I explained to him what flyover country meant. He sympathized and pointed out that for many Americans, India had been flyover country. The Indian test certainly changed its image, at least for a while. This is an opportune time to develop a regional strategy that will not only deal with the immediate proliferation problem, but also with our long-term interest in this hitherto important quarter of the world. Thank you.
Well, we thank you very much for that overview. Professor Cohen will recognize the questions and repeat the questions.
The question is whether in the future it might be worthwhile and important, useful having an India on the Security Council to get an Indian perspective on a number of international issues. And that right now it seems unlikely because there's this negative reaction to the tests. I agree. I do think that the Indians have something to contribute. They're particularly strong in the non-aligned movement or the non-Western world. The UN is filled, in fact, with Indian diplomats and officials on secondment to the UN. I used to argue, until May, that to my Indian friends, especially my hawkish friends, that India should be on the Security Council. And in fact, I did a piece in the Washington Post 1992 to this effect. And that the U.S. should support India as a member of the Security Council on the same terms we're likely to support Japan and Germany, that is, as a non-nuclear member of the Council. And the Indian calculation, at least the calculation of a very few people, because only a very few people made this decision, was that maybe they could blow their way onto the Council. That the world respects power, nuclear weapons are a symbol of this power, let's have nuclear weapons, we'll get respect. I think that was a wrong calculation. It also threw out the window the other image of India, that is a country which has produced thinkers and people and ideas which have contributed to conflict resolution around the world, especially the United States. And I think that Indians are in the midst of a big debate now about the nature of their own country. It's a healthy debate, but it's not going to be concluded soon. Do they want to be a new aggressive China-like country, country as China becomes more moderate, or do they want to, in a sense, be a good country that doesn't get rewarded for being good? And I think the core of the problem has been that India didn't get much for being good, for being a fairly reasonable and responsible member of the international community. And that's a problem which is intractable. I wouldn't begin to discuss it here. The question is, do the Indians and the Pakistanis view China as a long-term threat? Right. In part because China's relationship with the U.S. is so close and we wouldn't intervene. That's a perception in New Delhi, but certainly not in Pakistan. Pakistanis have received an enormous amount of assistance from China. China used Pakistan strategically for two purposes. By supporting Pakistan, China could at one step balance the Soviets in Afghanistan and the Indians in South Asia. And Pakistan is still useful to the Chinese in that regard. And what the Indians have to worry about is that the Chinese will fight the Indians to the last Pakistani. I think that, but the Indian view very much has been, and I think it's completely wrong, that there is a U.S.-China coalition against India, and that Pakistan is part of this coalition. That these three countries have ganged up on India. And you ask Indians why, or some Indians why, and they say, well, because we're one of the great world powers we could be, and you want to keep us down, you want to suppress us. That the Americans and the Chinese don't want to see a new great power rise in the world today. I don't think American officials have thought about that, let alone developed a strategy to keep India from emerging. Many Americans would like nothing better than to see a large, democratic, reasonably responsible country emerge as a great power. But the belief in New Delhi, especially among the hawks, is that, or to explain their lack of international status, perhaps, is that there has to be an enemy out there holding you back. And the enemy for many Indians is China, but also the United States in partnership with China. And there are historic reasons for this, but I'll go into that later. Did the bombing in Afghanistan affect America's relations with Pakistan? Yes, very much. I don't know the details of this. It's not quite clear whether we informed the Pakistani government that we were going to be flying Tomahawks over their territory. And also, apparently, several landed in Pakistan, according to the Pakistani newspapers. And one Pakistani scientist has said, we will take these and we will reverse engineer them and build our own Tomahawks. Lots of luck. But I think that what it did was it forced the Pakistani government to do something. And it didn't know what to do. Pakistan is deeply embroiled in Afghanistan. In a sense, there's a secret or hidden government in Pakistan, the intelligence services, and they've been deeply involved in supporting the Taliban, whose ally has bin Laden. And this is embarrassing to that part of Pakistan. On the other hand, the Pakistanis are trying to cooperate with the United States in dealing with terrorists, because many terrorists happen to commute through Pakistan. If they don't live in Pakistan, they live in Afghanistan or remote parts of Pakistan. And Karachi is a major transit point for these fellows as they come in and out on their daily rounds. So the Pakistan government didn't know whether to appease the Americans or whether to criticize the Americans. And they're still caught in this bind. It certainly makes it more difficult for them to sign a comprehensive test ban treaty. But I think Pakistan's problems are deeper than any of this. It's a country that has deep social, cultural, economic problems, and they're not getting better. And to my mind, Pakistan is probably the breakup of Pakistan, or at least the loosening of Pakistan, even further fragmentation of Pakistan. It could be a serious security problem for India. It certainly is for Iran, and there's an impending or a possible Iran-Pakistan conflict by proxy in Afghanistan. And that's largely over religious sectarian disputes, Sunni Shia. The question is, actually a couple of questions. What should the U.S. do to improve its relationship with India, if I can boil that down? And then secondly, how should we cope with the Pakistan-China relationship, which may have implications for Chinese support for extremist Muslims? Yeah, the latter is not true. The latter is, in fact, works the other way around. Chinese are very angry with Pakistan because some Pakistanis, a lot of these Pakistani operations are not government controlled, or they're run by various intelligence agencies in Pakistan. Nobody really knows who's responsible for them. There have been some Pakistani support for Islamic fundamentalists or Islamist fundamentalists in Central Asia. And that begins to threaten the Muslim sections of Western China. Chinese are very, very nervous about this, and there's been conversations between the Chinese and the Pakistanis. Chinese, in effect, telling the Pakistanis, don't do this. We don't want to see fostering Islamic extremism in our Western provinces. So I think there's, in fact, a possible break between China and Pakistan on that issue. And the Indians have portrayed themselves as the bulwark against the green wave, against the green revolution. And India, in fact, does have within its own population over 120 million Muslims. It's a larger Muslim population than Pakistan. And India is very concerned that Islamic extremism not catch hold within the country itself. So the Indians are pretty good at trying to balance Sunni Shia disputes, Hindu-Muslim disputes. They work at it. They spend a lot of time working at it. So I don't think that I don't think there's a Chinese, as Huntington, you got this argument from Huntington, that so if it's a Sinic Islamic alliance. I don't see any evidence of this at all, except a few missile sales by the Chinese to the Iraqis and so forth, but that's about it. The first question I think is more difficult to answer, that is, what should we do to improve our relationship with India? And when I go to New Delhi in about 2 weeks, I'll say, what should you do to improve your relationship with the United States? And we'll both sort of stare at each other and mumble for a while. I wouldn't know where to begin. It's such a long list of things that need to be done. But my major concern, now that especially I'm in Washington, has been the inattention of the U.S. government to South Asia. My own view for many years has been that American foreign policy, generally, should devote proportionate attention to our relative interests. And I certainly would not put South Asia at the top of that list. I think in terms of critical worlds of the region today, I think Northeast Asia far outstrips the rest, except for the transformation of Russia, which would be also significant. So I think we should spend most of our time worrying about Northeast Asia, the Korean breakout, possible nuclearization of Japan, which would transform the world completely. And also the Middle East is important. And then you get to Africa, Latin America, and so forth. But India is not Southern Africa, nor I think is it Latin America. It does abut on China. It has influence in the Middle East. It's a potential military power of its own, as well as a nuclear power now. It's a large, efficient army. So I think that proportionate attention is the proper word. We shouldn't get taken away by the headline of the day. And I think the U.S. government, having been in it, I can say this pretty honestly, is unable to focus in a routine, effective way on areas that are not crisis areas. So I think there's a very heavy obligation for people outside the government to, in fact, raise the issues, ask the questions, poke the government, our government, and not in the sense, why aren't you more pro-Indian, but perhaps ask the question, why don't you examine more carefully and pursue more fully those interests we do have in countries like India or Pakistan? It's hard for bureaucrats to respond, except when there's a crisis, but I do my best, and hopefully you'll join me. Was the breakup of the subcontinent and the formation of Pakistan, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, inevitable, or was it a blunder? Absolutely a blunder. When I was a graduate student, I did my dissertation and then wrote a book on the Indian Army. And I interviewed a lot of retired British generals, including Auchinleck, who were involved in partition. I also interviewed retired Indian and Pakistani generals, among others. And almost to a man, they all agreed that the partition was unnecessary and was a tragedy. And partitions almost everywhere don't work out well. But the British philosophy was divide and quit. Let's divide and go home. Canada, the United States, Israel, Palestine, South Asia, a lot of places. And while the British were very good at leaving behind institutions of governance, they also inadvertently perhaps set up competing rivalries, which have endured through the years, especially in South Asia. Part of the blame also goes to the Indian politicians and to the Pakistani politicians. It wasn't the British fault. But if the British had decided to stay on for another year and maybe take a few losses in terms of manpower, they could have either had a peaceful partition or they could have prevented partition. Pushing them towards partition was Nehru and the Congress Party, and on the Muslim side, Jinnah and others, who wanted their own countries right away. I think if everybody had been a little bit more patient and held out, the partition at least could have been managed more successfully. Certainly Kashmir could have been avoided. Where did the Indians and Pakistanis obtain the fissile material to develop nuclear weapons? I think I know. The Pakistanis, a number of years ago, this goes back to 75 or, no, 78 or, no, it goes back to 77, 78. A Pakistani scientist working in Europe stole, which is the technical term, stole the plans for a uranium enrichment facility from Urenco, which is in Belgium, I guess. And this was his great scientific accomplishment. He was a competent man, but he certainly knew how to use a Xerox machine also. And out of those plans, they then developed they then purchased the materials to make a uranium enrichment facility. They're very complex, huge numbers of centrifuges, hundreds and hundreds of them, maybe thousands of centrifuges, and they whirl the uranium hexafluoride around till you get enriched uranium, and that can be then fabricated into a nuclear weapon. There are public reports which seem to be credible that the Chinese provided the design to build that weapon. So the Pakistani bomb was primarily foreign technology and foreign assistance. The uranium, the enriched uranium itself, uranium oxide, was purchased on the open market, and apparently Libya played some role in this at one time. The Libyans, according to a number of reports, offered to assist the Pakistanis and may have helped pay for some of this in exchange for a nuclear weapon. Successive Pakistani leaders have not taken up the offer, for which we can be very grateful. So far, the Pakistani leadership has shown considerable restraint, I think, in sharing this technology with others. In the future, in the case of a Pakistani that's beginning to unravel, you have a Soviet-like situation on a much smaller scale, but Pakistan would have strong friends and allies throughout the Islamic world and elsewhere, also North Korea. I suspect that there's a lot more between the Pakistan-North Korean relationship than we know publicly. In the case of India, the Indian nuclear program is almost entirely indigenous in the sense that the plutonium that was used to build their bomb, they have a plutonium path towards weapons, was a byproduct of various reactors and a separation facility that we helped design and they built a long time ago. And, but they would have done it one way or another because all the plans for these things are publicly available. This is all. The Iraqis, in fact, used old declassified plans from the V-2 rocket. And this stuff has been circulating around for 30, 40 years. It's nothing. If a country wants to do it, if it has a modest level of scientific accomplishment, it can go pretty far down that road. And the North Koreans would be one example of this. That's it. The question is, why do I describe the BJP as a right-wing Hindu fundamentalist party, in quotes, when The Economist and other American The Economist and American magazines and newspapers use that name. In fact, they call themselves this sometimes. But the BJP stands for Bharatiya Janata Party, Indian People's Party, which itself, in fact, is a successor to an earlier party called, and it's part of a tradition that goes back at least 75 or 100 years. The BJP is not a monolith. It is composed of people who are Western-oriented, I won't say secular, but would not like to impose a Hindu Raj on India. It's also composed of people who would like to see India Indian government, in a sense, be governed by Hindu laws, and would also take a very punitive stance towards non-Hindus in India. They would like to purify Hinduism in India. They would like to ensure that all of those millions of Indian Muslims who once were Hindus, if they're not reconverted back to Hinduism, at least don't do anything which would offend a Hindu. And the same would apply to Christians and other religions. And that element of the party is also not averse to using violence. And the BJP is also part of a larger coalition of groups, some of which, the analogy might be, say, the right wing of the Republican Party in the United States, where you do get perfectly honorable, respectable people of strong beliefs, but then you may get people coming in from the fringes who sign up for a while, at least, who are a little shady and not averse to perhaps using violence or terrorism at the far fringes, not necessarily the Republican Party, but the groups that would support the Republican candidates. Every political system produces a spectrum draws on a spectrum of its population. The BJP draws upon largely center-right in Indian population. It itself is also characterized as being a middle-class party, and most of its supporters typically are small businessmen, professionals, and so forth. Yeah, I think that's So saying it's a Hindu fundamentalist party, Hindu nationalist party, is inaccurate in the sense that it's not only for Hindus. They do have some Muslims in the party, although most of them have recently left the party, and they claim to treat Muslims equally with other Indians. In practice, things may turn out to be different. The question is, if we move closer to India with its present leadership, what effect would that have on the Muslim world? I don't think the present leadership is going to last very long. Not that it's destined to fail, but because it's such a weak, tenuous coalition government, the Indian newspapers are filled on a regular basis with talks about new elections and the coalition restructuring itself and so forth. What's happening now, probably a very healthy thing for Indian politics, for any democracy, is that the Congress Party of India, which had really decayed badly I think under Indira Gandhi and then to some degree under Rajiv Gandhi, has now started reinventing itself. It has a new leader in the form of Rajiv Gandhi's widow, Sonia Gandhi, an Italian, or an Indian now of Italian citizen, or former Italian citizen now an Indian, who's actually learning Hindi, and she's not too bad, better than mine. And so the Congress Party in opposition is beginning to restructure itself and to do things it wouldn't have done while it was in power. I suspect that in 4 years or so there may be a new election, maybe sooner than that, and the BJP will probably go out, and the Congress will come in, perhaps as head of another coalition party, but this is very conjectural. Would our relations with the Muslim world be hurt by if we worked more closely with the BJP? I don't think so. I don't think I don't think these issues are Hindu versus Muslim. Most of these Middle East countries don't care that much about the fate of Kashmir, except for some Saudis who sent guerrilla fighters into Kashmir in a jihad. My theory is that some of the Middle East, some of the Arab countries in particular, want to get rid of their extremists, so they ship them off to war zones elsewhere in the hope that they'll get perforated sooner rather than later. And so I don't think that that's going to make much of a difference in our relationship with the Arab world, certainly, and probably with other Muslim countries, because India is not seen as even under the BJP, as a Hindu country. It is a government which is more, quote, pro-Hindu than perhaps other governments have been. But it's still the second largest Muslim country in the world after Indonesia, if you treat India as a Muslim country. So there are enough Muslims in India that I think other Muslims around the world see that it's not a question of Hindu versus Muslim, but Muslims living in a country, not always comfortably, but in reasonable security and reasonable satisfaction.
But it's been a wonderfully enjoyable evening, I know, and on behalf of the audience, I'd like to thank you for a most informative time. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.